Reprise du débat. The honourable member for Scarborough Southwest.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles, for her speech and for sharing her time.
Like my other colleagues on this side of the chamber, we're going to be opposing this bill at third reading, and the reasons are many. And my colleagues have spoken many times today about the reasons why we are not supporting this bill. I mean, first off, here we are with another omnibus bill, 150 pages, 270 clauses. Now, when the Conservatives were in opposition, Mr. Speaker, they used to rail against the then Liberal government for bringing in budget bills that were smaller than this. But I have to give them credit. This is actually a pretty trim budget bill for them, because we've had budget bills that are 3 and 4 and 500 pages long with this government that contain so many clauses that have absolutely nothing to do with the budget. Unfortunately, I mean, this one does too, just a few less than in previous budgets. Of course, they've included retroactively changing the Access to Information Act. And we heard, of course, the Minister for Public Safety get up in the House today and talk about the will of Parliament. Well, Mr. Speaker, the will of Parliament exists after Parliament has voted on something. These changes are to retroactively make changes to absolve the RCMP of responsibility for destruction of documents that happened before Parliament exerted its will, Mr. Speaker. And I really can't find a reason, a justifiable reason, why any government would put that kind of a change in place. It really sets a dangerous precedent, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to just go, of course, and mention Suzanne Legault, Canada's Independent Information Commissioner, has said that the Conservatives' action set a perilous precedent against Canadians' quasi-constitutional right to know, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this isn't the first dangerous precedent that this government has set. Then, of course, they're slipping in some balanced budget legislation into this bill. And I mean, we only have to look at the previous Conservative government in Alberta to know what happens to balanced budget legislation. When they don't like it, they just change it. But of course, if this government had actually had to deal with this kind of legislation being in place when they came into power, the front bench ministers would owe the Canadian taxpayers over $3 million for all the deficits that they've put in. And then, of course, adding $150 billion to Canada's national debt, Mr. Speaker, that's something that our children and grandchildren are likely to be having to pay off because of many of the decisions that they made. Now, they've expanded the universal child tax credit, Mr. Speaker, and they talk about how much this is going to help families. Mr. Speaker, we agree that families do need help because after almost 10 years of a Conservative government, they are struggling. But time and time again in this House, we've heard the Conservatives say that we, the NDP, are going to get rid of that. They're not speaking the truth when they say that, Mr. Speaker. We have committed to keeping that money in Canadian families' pockets because it's true that families are struggling after a decade of Conservative rule in Canada. But we're going to go well beyond that, Mr. Speaker. We're not just going to let Canadians have that money back, Mr. Speaker. We're going to bring in a national childcare plan that is actually going to create 1 million new childcare spaces in Canada at $15 a day. See, the thing that both the Conservatives and Liberals don't want to tell you is that with both of their plans, it leaves childcare costs in Canada sky high and unaffordable for many families. For folks in Toronto, many people are having to spend over 30% of their annual income for childcare, Mr. Speaker. In Toronto, people are paying, on average, between $1,000 and $2,000 a month. So $1,676 is the figure that's mentioned. Now, you look at the entire amount that the Conservative plan gives back to families is only $1,900 a month. So that's going to pay for a little bit more than 1 month of childcare for families that need it. What are families supposed to do for the other 11 months of the year, Mr. Speaker? So what's happening is many families are unfortunately having to forego having an income from one of those parents to actually pay for childcare so that instead the parent stays home. And what does that mean, Mr. Speaker? Families fall further behind. Because in a city like Toronto, the vast majority of families need 2 incomes in order to make ends meet. So if one person has to stay home, that family falls further behind. Not to mention, it's actually hurtful for the economy, Mr. Speaker, because less people are out there working and making money. And then, of course, it hurts the Treasury as well, because less people are out there paying taxes, and more people need to receive benefits, Mr. Speaker. So, I mean, it's just completely backwards what the other 2 parties are wanting to do. I mean, they're fighting themselves on the wrong issue, Mr. Speaker. What needs to be tackled is the high cost of childcare. And it's only the NDP that's made a commitment to actually deal with those high costs. Of course, we don't oppose everything in the budget. There are, and as my colleague from Trois-Rivières mentioned, there are several diluted NDP initiatives that are in this Budget Implementation Act. And the first one I'll mention is the way the Conservatives decided to try to take cutting small business taxes out of the NDP platform. But they couldn't even do that right, Mr. Speaker. The NDP committed to reducing small business taxes from 11 to 10 to 9% in 2 years, Mr. Speaker. What are they doing? 0.5%, 0.5%, 0.5%, 0.5% over 4 years, Mr. Speaker. I think small business owners will know who they'll be better off under. It'll be an NDP government, Mr. Speaker, because by the time their full tax cut comes into play, they'll already have 2 full years of the full 9% lower tax rate that an NDP government will bring in, Mr. Speaker. And of course, you know, they really only did this because it's an election year, Mr. Speaker, and they know that this has been our long-standing position, and they know we're not going to be able to support the budget because of ridiculous policies like income splitting, which is only going to help the top 15% of income earners, Mr. Speaker, and yet cost the federal treasury $2.5 billion. Now, what's the projected surplus for this year, Mr. Speaker? It's about $1.8, $1.4 billion, somewhere in that range. It doesn't matter. It's well below $2.5 billion, which means they're actually adding to the deficit and adding to the national debt in order to pay for a program that is actually going to the people that need the help the least, Mr. Speaker. Because the vast majority of people that can take full advantage of income splitting are in the higher income brackets, Mr. Speaker. They're not in the lower income brackets. So this is their plan. And then, of course, there's the doubling of TFSAs. And Conservative after Conservative after Conservative has talked about how 11 million Canadians have opened TFSAs. But what they, again, won't tell you is what small percentage of Canadians are actually currently, out of those 11 million accounts that were open, less than 30% of them actually get filled up every year, Mr. Speaker. So, of course, they forget to talk about that. They talk about 11 million as if 1/3 of Canadians are maximizing the current TFSA limits of $5,000 a year. Not even close, Mr. Speaker. It's less than 30% of the 30% that have opened accounts that are actually maximizing out the ones that are there now. You know, Canadians do need ways to save money for their retirement, Mr. Speaker, but most can't even put in $5,000 a year because they're paying exorbitant costs for childcare, because they're paying more sometimes when they have to go get prescription medication, or cost of living has gone up, or, of course, in a city like Toronto where only half, less than half, of all the working people in Toronto have a full-time permanent job. The vast majority now are working precarious part-time jobs. And of course, the situation gets even worse with young Canadians, where 13% are now unemployed. Now, some shocking statistics came out over the last 2 decades, the last 18 years. So that's 9 years of Liberal government and then 9 years of Conservative government. Minimum wage workers have skyrocketed. The number of minimum wage workers has increased by 94%. They used to make up 3% of Ontario's workers. Now they make up 12% of Ontario's workers. That's what these 2 parties have done. They're sending us to the bottom, Mr. Speaker, just to pay for the tax cuts for corporations, Mr. Speaker. So that corporations now have more money squirreled away in the bank than the total size of our national debt, Mr. Speaker. And they're not going to go and spend that money and invest it in Canada. They're going to leave it in the bank, Mr. Speaker, and that is dead money. And that is money that could be used to actually improve our economy, Mr. Speaker. And I see that you've given me the notice to wrap up, so I'll be happy to take everyone's questions. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, the Honourable Minister of State.
Mr. Speaker, the concept of liquidity is defined as the availability of liquid assets to a market or a company. So, Mr. Speaker, when a company, a job-creating company, has cash on hand or liquidity available, when there's fluctuations in the market, variations in commodity prices, changes in investment certainties, they can do things like retain jobs, or they can invest in R&D, in new markets and new products. In Canada, when a company has cash on hand, the NDP consistently vilifies this somehow as a bad thing. We've never heard them talk about ways to leverage this into R&D, which we've done through various incentive programs, Mr. Speaker. Over and over again, the NDP put forward these fallacies with regard to how job-creating companies need to spur growth. They talk about increasing taxes. They talk about somehow trying to equalize wealth, Mr. Speaker, by penalizing job-creating companies. On this side of the House, we do the opposite. And I'm wondering if my colleague opposite can reconcile his understanding or lack thereof of the concept of liquidity with the NDP's long-standing desire to keep increasing taxes on job-creating companies.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough Southwest.
Maybe the member wasn't listening at the end of my speech when I talked about the fact that Canadian companies have over $600 billion of dead money that they're not using. They're not using it on improving productivity. They're not using it on increasing research and development. They're not using it on employing more Canadians. And we talk about commodity prices, Mr. Speaker. This is a government that put all their eggs in one basket, that bet the farm on the fact that oil prices were going to stay high forever. Forever, Mr. Speaker. And that's a member from Alberta who should know that commodity prices and oil prices, they go up and then they go down, and then they go up and then they go down. But they banked on it staying high forever, Mr. Speaker. So she wants to talk about some things that we would do. We would provide stable and predictable funding for successful Aboriginal skills and employment training strategy model for other job programs to help First Nations and other Aboriginal groups fill job shortages. We would work with the provinces to build long-term skills training to fill the skills shortages in certain provinces. We would fix the temporary foreign worker program. There's lots of things that an NDP government would do, Mr. Speaker, but I'd like to hear more questions.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Member for Trinity Spadina.
Thank you very much. I listened with interest as my colleague from Toronto spoke about some of the priorities, and one of the issues that I didn't hear him discuss was infrastructure and housing, but more importantly, transit. I know that the party he represents has made a huge commitment to funding transit, and I note that he didn't raise the issue. So I have two questions for him. One is the NDP government in Queen's Park in the early 90s was the first provincial government to cut subsidies for operating agreements to the Toronto Transit Commission. Is the transit money your party is putting on the table for operating, and will they restore those NDP cuts which devastated the TTC in the early 90s? And the second question is, does your party support the Scarborough subway?
The member for Trinity Spadina twice made reference to I'm not part of this debate, but the question is to be directed to me, not to other members in the House. The Honourable Member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And he might be a member from Toronto, but I'm a member from Scarborough, Mr. Speaker. And it's really funny that we're talking about transportation because, of course, that member and several other GTA area Liberals, they called for the teardown of the Gardiner Expressway 2 weeks ago now. And yet the Liberal city councillor in my area, who is the co-chair of the federal Liberal candidates campaign, voted to keep the Gardiner. And that's an interesting juxtaposition. I don't know how they're going to square that circle. But the Scarborough subway, Mr. Speaker, that is a great question. We had a plan in the city that was fully funded by a provincial government, in order to provide LRTs that would expand transit into the far reaches of Scarborough, and it was fully funded. And then that member participated in debates and was part of a city council that actually changed their mind and changed their mind again and changed their mind again and ended up deciding to vote for a subway that's going to cost $1 billion more that isn't funded. And every person in Toronto is now paying an extra $7 to $8 of tax every time they get their property tax bill to pay for that subway that doesn't go any further into Scarborough than the existing transit, and it's going to cost $1 billion more, which leaves no money for the Shepherd LRT, which is not going to bring transit out to Centennial College or U of T Scarborough campus or out to Malvern or Morningside Heights, where transit is desperately needed. And that's what they've done, Mr. Speaker.
Order.